Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hi everyone, I'm Krista Contreras and I'm the Director of Inform at the Commonwealth Club. Welcome to tonight's program, Learning to be a Son and a Father with NBC's Craig Melvin. This conversation will be moderated by KQED News anchor Brian Watt. This is a part of our Good Lit series, generously supported by the Bernard Osher Foundation, and we'd also like to give a special thanks to Marcus Bookstore in Oakland, California for partnering on tonight's program. If you'd like to ask either Craig or Brian a question during our program, you can do so in the chat or comment section of the live stream that you're currently watching. Finally, the Commonwealth Club is going full speed ahead with the full slate of live and online programming this summer and fall. We ask that you consider donating to the club to help us continue our work this year and beyond. Visit us at commonwealthclub.org/online to learn more, and you can also click the blue donate button you see on the right side of your screen live during this program. Now, please join me in welcoming Craig Melvin and Brian Watt to Inforum.
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's virtual program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Brian Watt, morning news anchor for KQED Radio in San Francisco. Tonight, I am excited to be in conversation with Craig Melvin, news anchor on NBC's The Today Show. We're here to discuss his new book, Pops, Learning to be a Son and a Father. Craig writes from the start of the book that it is not a memoir, but an investigation of a subject that happens to be personal. What we get is a poignant but often blunt story of fatherhood and the universal aspiration among men to be the best parents they can be. He takes us on his journey to reconciliation with his father, who has battled alcohol addiction. He tells us of the support he received from surrogate father figures, shares stories from fathers he interviews as part of his Dad's Got This series on The Today Show. So before we begin, let me remind the audience one more time that if you would like to ask us a question, please ask it in the chat or comment section. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible towards the end of this program. And if you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's effort in making virtual programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org. Now, let's get started. First of all, Craig Melvin, welcome.
Brian Watt, thank you for having me. And a big thanks to the Bernard Osher Foundation and the Commonwealth Club for sponsoring tonight's event. Thank you all.
Yeah, well, it's cool to meet you because I feel like we actually have quite a few things in common. We both wake up early to do the news, though I think your audience is a lot bigger than mine, and your audience can see you when they're doing the news. And I know that's a good thing. We're also both Black men from the South. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and that is right up the road from Columbia, South Carolina, where Craig Melvin grew up. So thanks very much. It was good to meet Del, and it was people see proof that you're a father.
Yes. Oh, there's plenty of proof.
So let's talk about this relationship with your father. You are investigating this relationship, at least at the start of the book. Why do you think your father was willing to participate in your investigation?
Well, it's a good question, but I think that my dad, I think like a lot of folks of his generation, he's almost 70. And I think when you get to a point in life and you realize you've got more years behind you than you do ahead of you, you start to look at things a little differently. And my dad is no different in that regard. And I also think that, a couple years ago when he checked into rehab, that changed his worldview in a pretty dramatic way. And consequently, after that, he and I had a number of conversations where we talked about his story and how powerful it was and how inspiring it was and how We both thought some good could come of it. And so after a number of those conversations, the sort of, the stars just sort of aligned, if you will. So I think that's why he initially agreed to participate. And I think, like myself, he was reticent, shall we say. And as we had our conversations, I mean, it was, I interviewed my dad for probably about 4.5 hours, and that took about, 4 or 5 different sessions. And I think, scratch that, I know now that he found the process as cathartic as I found it.
Cathartic. Well, I mean, you do a really good job in this book, sort of laying that foundation of the way your father and probably my father were brought up. The elders told you what they wanted you to know. They didn't talk about things they didn't want to talk about. And if you were a kid, you weren't really, really supposed to be asking questions about things you might have been curious about, but you kind of had a sense that you needed to not ask questions. So I imagine that was a pretty hard thing to push through, as much as maybe both of you needed the catharsis. My dad's not used to answering questions, and not just because he is of that generation. I just don't, he's just not a guy that's an open book. I mean, you and I are journalists. We ask questions, we engage in conversations. That's the nature of what we do. And I think sometimes for people like us, we take for granted that's it's counterintuitive for a lot of people, especially when you're talking about things of a very personal and private nature, things that are hurtful, emotional, sensitive. Like that's not who he is. So yeah, I mean, it was just, at first it was very weird because I had to decide early on whether I was going to approach this as Lawrence Melvin, my father, Lawrence Melvin's son, or was I going to approach it as purely a journalist, or whether it was going to be a combination of the two. And ultimately, I decided it would be beneficial for both of us if I did not approach it as his son entirely, but I approached it as a journalist. And it helped, quite frankly, it helped that I didn't know a lot. Like there was so much I didn't know. I didn't have to fake the curiosity. Right. Interesting. We get a lot of visuals in this book on his alcohol addiction. Always a beer in one hand, a cigarette in the other. Drinking and driving, literally. DUIs. But there's actually a short passage in chapter 2. I was going to get you to just read a minute of it. And in this moment, I feel like after kind of giving us a sense of what his alcoholism could look like, it's like you get why. Can you share that passage with us?
Yeah, sure. Chapter 2.
Page 42, yeah.
Page 42. I'm going to start with my dad's refusal.
Okay.
I'll start there, bottom of page 42.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Or you can start with a host of reasons. A host of reasons.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is a good passage. It helps that you've read the book, Brian. Thank you.
Well, it's a good book.
A host of reasons kept him from being the dad I wanted him to be, the dad I needed. He didn't set out to be a bad father. He didn't want to not be around, but in a way, he became a parent with both hands tied behind his back, hindered by his family history, his own parent shortcomings and dearth of resources, his lack of a good role model in his own father. There was the systemic and overt racism he faced as a Black man of his generation, and there was the legacy of alcoholism and likely an undiagnosed underlying depression. Was his drinking in part an attempt to self-medicate? Possibly. My dad spent the better part of his life unhappy about various aspects of his life, and he found comfort and solace in alcohol. for most of his life, he was able to manage it to a certain extent until he couldn't.
So there is a lot in that passage, but right there at the end, until he couldn't. What was the straw that broke the camel's back?
Yeah, my dad was a mail clerk, third shift, U.S. Postal Service for almost 40 years. And he worked the third shift because you make a few extra bucks on that shift. And his work as a civil servant was the rung on the ladder to get us to the middle class. He didn't go to college. He spent 4 years in the military. But he knew the importance of education. He wanted to make sure that me and my brothers went to school, and that was important to him. So he took a job that he didn't enjoy, by and large. He was an assembly line worker for the better part of 4 decades almost, and he did it for us. And we didn't fully appreciate it until we were much older, mind you. But the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, was when he decided to retire. And because when you work that shift, Brian, you don't develop a lot of hobbies or interests or friendships to cultivate because you're working at night, you're sleeping during the day. And that's a hard life to live. And I know, I technically don't work the third shift. I work sort of the second and a half shift, if you will. But it's hard for your body clock. And he did it for almost 40 years. So he was a casual drinker when he started in the military in his early 20s. And then sort of casual drinking became recreational drinking. And then recreational drinking became crutch drinking, and then it just became drinking. And when he retired, he didn't really have anything else to do. And part of what was keeping him sober and functional was the job. He had to go to work. And so, and then all of a sudden, when you don't have to be anywhere at a certain time, and you don't have anything else to do, golf or tennis or church or whatever, I don't think a lot of folks fully appreciate what that does to a person who's newly retired. And so anyway, my dad started to drink more and more. And then we lost my niece to pediatric cancer. She was 3 at the time when she died, and that sent him into a spiral. And so the drinking it got out of hand. And then all of a sudden he, as you pointed out a few moments ago, there was a DUI and that was sort of the catalyst. That was the impetus, if you will, for change.
I see. And I am kind of blown away because there will be long passages where you talk about his drinking, about the fact that he was a drunk, about the way he smelled, embarrassing you. And I will lose sight of the fact that the man did work a full-time job. He worked a graveyard shift. He served in the military. And so he provided. And you mentioned this. He got you guys into the class. And I think that's what I think a lot of people don't realize is that there are a lot of people who really do manage alcoholism in some way.
Well, most alcoholics, not just most, the overwhelming majority of alcoholics are functional alcoholics. Like they're not like, fall down, sloppy, embarrass the family drunks. These are people who are holding down jobs. And, I didn't realize until I started doing research for the book and interviewing my dad. My dad, toward the latter part of his time at the post office, he would take his breaks and drive down to the corner store on his breaks and sit and pound like tall boys. I don't know if tall boys are in San Francisco. I don't know if folks know what tall boys are, but they're the
Well, you call them a 40 ounce. It might have been the 40 ounce of the day.
Right. And I'll be honest with you, when I found that out, I won't say I was more impressed, but understanding his addiction and understanding how long he was grappling with it, I did probably develop more of an appreciation during the research for the book, because I mean, here was a guy that managed to not get fired. And he was either drunk, hungover, or drinking at work. The last 5-10 years, the majority of the time, that's a feat.
Yeah. So is this part of like seeing past this, through this, and all that he did in spite of this, part of learning to be a son yourself?
Yes. I've said before, I think you can be just as motivated by negative examples as you are by positive examples. And when I was younger, I didn't always know what I wanted to be when I grew up, or the kind of, husband I wanted to be, or dad I necessarily wanted to be as I got older, into my 20s or early 30s. But I did know, based on what I'd seen, I don't want to be my dad. I don't want to be anything like my dad. And that motivated me early on, probably more in a negative way than a positive way. But it was motivation. And so, but I also think now I've got a 7-year-old that you just met, my son, and my 4-year-old who I managed to keep at the door. I think that for me, a lot of my parenting now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but anyway, I think about being young and the dad that I saw and the impressions I had of him. And I'm very, because I like to have a glass of wine or a glass of bourbon or beer occasionally. But I think sometimes back to when I was younger, and how a lot of my most of my memories are of my dad always having a drink in his hand, and that always being a part of our interactions. And so I've become quite cognizant of that. And well, I mean, for good, for bad, whatever. Now, but granted, my son thinks that I have a coffee problem. He thinks that, and I'm fine with him thinking that I have some sort of caffeine addiction, versus the other. But it's each generation, Brian tries to do a little bit better, and that's what I'm going to do.
And once you guys pushed through this to the place where you could talk openly, what would you say was the most valuable memory that you guys could share? Like something you could go back to that it helped both of you a lot to talk about?
Do you mean when he was struggling with his addiction, or do you mean on the other side of it?
On the other side, just, once you guys got to having some real frank talks about this, and obviously you've got that split between whether you're being the journalist or being the son. But I just wonder if you write vividly about helping him fix that Le Mans. You write vividly about that pipe you guys had to repair going out.
Yeah.
And the mowing lawn thing. That was bonding time, but it sounds like it was pretty quiet. But are there some like real episodes that you guys could look back at and go, this is what I was thinking. This is what I was thinking.
One of our most recent, I'll give you two memories. I'll give you one on both sides. On this side, post-recovery, when I went down to Statesboro, Georgia, and I write about it in the book, and he'd been there for, at that point, 6 or 8 weeks, and we had tried rehab before to no avail. And I get there, I could fly in because of work. I could only fly in for a day or two, and I get there, and he meets me at the door, and he gives me a big hug, huge hug. And we're not big huggers in my family. And he's crying, and I'm crying, and he gives me an envelope, and there's a letter in the envelope that he's written. And it's essentially an explanation, if you will. It is my father in his own words, writing about how he came to be the man that he was. He writes about, his regrets and his hopes, and he puts it all on paper. And, at that point, I'm 40 years old, Brian. Actually, at that point, I'm 39. And my father had never written me a letter. So that was a turning point for us. And that sort of marked, if you will, this sort of new chapter in our story. Before that, I don't know. I mean, there were, I would contend that one of the, and he might disagree with this, but one of the most salient memories that I have, I was probably 24, 25. No, I was 25. I was 25 because, and I write about it in the book, but, my dad at that point, he struggled with alcohol, and then he picked up gambling. And for folks who aren't familiar with addictions, those are the two worst that you can have simultaneously. Like you can't be addicted. I mean, gambling and drugs and alcohol, that's a dangerous recipe. So anyway, I digress. But he had developed this gambling habit, video poker back in South Carolina. If you recall, in the 90s, it was quite the scourge. And he had squandered essentially his life savings. And, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree with regards to addiction and just bad habits in general. And in my mid-20s, I drank, but not like he did, but I picked up gambling to the point where I had, I was earning, I was doing the evening news in my mid-20s in Columbia, South Carolina. I was earning a pretty good wage. And when I was 25, I went to Vegas 3 times in 1 year. I remember it.
It wasn't to see Cirque du Soleil, I guess.
It was not. It was not to see Cirque du Soleil.
Okay.
And I had made some pretty bad choices. And I, to the point where I bought my first house at the age of 23. I was very proud of it. It's a beautiful house in downtown Columbia. And my dad was over one weekend, and I needed a few bucks. I had to borrow money. And I was too proud to ask my mother or a friend. And I had to ask my dad, and I had to explain to him what was going on. And my dad, being my dad, uses as few words as possible to explain why my behavior was unacceptable. And I knew at that point that my dad wasn't just preaching a sermon, like he had lived a sermon, like he knew from whence he was speaking, and so that was it. Not to sound, Brian, I don't. I mean, I've been to Vegas since then, but never, nothing like that. And that was it. Those are the 2 memories that stick out.
They sound like pretty valuable memories. There's actually another passage that I thought would be really helpful for people to hear. This is actually in the introduction on page 8, and to me, this is the exclamation of this book. But you got inspired to celebrate fatherhood. And can you just give us a little bit of that right there?
Yeah, I will. This is the introduction of the book. Bottom of page 8, fathers need to be celebrated. I've been moved by so many of the dads I meet, their eloquence and emotion. Men don't generally talk about what we do as husbands and fathers. It's sort of in the nature of manhood not to, at least traditionally. We don't talk about our kids who are sick or vulnerable, who are gay or trans, who have challenges, who are excluded by other kids for whatever reason. We don't talk a lot about the satisfactions of raising our children, the pure joy. That's just not something that most men do. My dad barely talked, period. But the dads in our stories were laying it all out and forging deep emotional connections with their children and with other fathers. At the same time, without a lot of fuss or self-pity, they were taking care of what they thought needed to be done, like generations of American fathers before them, including Lawrence Melvin, who, despite his drinking problem, had one of the strongest work ethics I've ever known.
Now, it sounds like, based on what I read, that you were inspired to celebrate fatherhood. It sort of started when you did a visit to Salinas Valley State Prison for a story about a program for incarcerated fathers. What happened? That's here in California. It's down the road from San Francisco. So what happened? What did you see at Salinas Valley State Prison that really gave you a window into fatherhood?
It's funny because, we think about, I shouldn't say we, but I think a lot of folks think about fatherhood in the traditional sense. And a producer, like most of the really good stories that I've done over the course of my career, a producer talked me into traveling from New York to California to the prison to do a story on a summer camp. And that's an oversimplification of what it is. But these are men who are incarcerated for an extended period of time. Most of these guys aren't getting out anytime soon. I mean, these aren't guys that have written bad checks, and they're sentenced. And after a few years, and they all have children, but after a few years, they're given the opportunity, because of good behavior on the inside, to spend a week with their children at a summer camp. And it's a traditional summer camp, arts and crafts and games and some sports and the kids come for 8 hours in a day. They travel to the prison on a bus in about a dozen or so, maybe 2 dozen, somewhere between 12 and 24. But they travel to the prison during the day, and obviously an environment that's observed and guarded, but they get to interact with their dads. And then at night, they go back to a campground and they spend the evening with other kids who are similarly situated. They are children of incarcerated men by and large. So anyway, a producer talks me into going out for the story. I am quite skeptical because I know the Today Show audience, or at least I thought I did. And I did not think that this is a story that would resonate with our audience. Men who were convicted of doing terrible things. And all of a sudden, here we are sort of showcasing them as fathers. So I get out there. And at this point, it's also important to note at that point, Brian, my son was probably, he would have been 3, maybe 4. And my wife would have been pregnant with our daughter. And
that's powerful.
Yeah. And so my view of fatherhood at that point, and so I'm having these conversations with these guys who are they're like us, they're, I don't know much about your history, but I would imagine there was probably a time when you were younger where you went left, and had you gone right, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now. And I know for damn sure in my 20s, I did some stupid stuff. And here were some men who had made some really bad choices. Or in a couple of cases, one bad choice, but they'd made some bad choices, but they'd had children. And there was one gentleman, I was talking to him on the yard, away from the rest of the group, but he had his son there with him. And I said to him, well, what would you say to those who are watching this or listening to this, who would contend because of what you did. And he had robbed a number of banks and he'd been involved in a number of armed robberies. And I said, well, what would you say to folks who would say, you don't deserve to have a week, a summer camp with your kids at the taxpayer's expense? What would you say to those people? And without missing a beat, he said, and at this point, he's got tears in his eyes and I've got tears in my eyes. He said, you know what? They might be right. I don't deserve it, but my kids do. You know, my kids didn't do anything. And if we're serious about breaking the cycle, then it doesn't really make much sense to deprive my children of the right to spend time with their dad, because kids of the incarcerated, they need parents, they need fathers too. So it turned into it was a classic example of how going into a story, if you're truly objective and truly unbiased, I think you can tell a powerful story.
I'm a little paused because that's an emotional moment in the book, and I think it sounds like also a moment when you were realizing that fatherhood is kind of hard for everybody.
It is, and in our traditional definitions of it, like it's not like I've got a wife and two kids, and we sort of live this. It's sort of this perfect life. And the more you talk to folks, the more at least I realize I'm an anomaly. Like most dads, like it's blended families and dads who are struggling with a variety of things, moms who are struggling with a variety of things, kids with special needs. It's like everyone's dealing with a lot. And one of the things that I discovered during the course of the book, everyone's dealing with a lot. We're all climbing mountains, but a lot of folks don't want to talk about the climb. And there's power in talking about the climb. I think there's a brotherhood that could be valuable if more of us were talking about the struggles that we all have. Because there are very few people. You start talking to other dads around the country in this series that I do for the Today Show called Dad's Got This. I get to crisscross the country and I get to talk to a bunch of dads who are overcoming just myriad obstacles. And you realize pretty quickly, we're all dealing with something. Like there's no perfect scenario.
Yeah. Is there like a lesson or two that you learned from one of those dads, from Dad's Got This, that you've applied directly? Not trying to stump you here, but I'm just wondering if you come away from something and go,
no. There's a common thread. I wouldn't say there's necessarily one lesson from one story, but there's a common thread throughout the dozens of stories I've done. Where I think, how old are your kids?
I have a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old. I have a 9-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl.
Yeah, you've got young kids. I knew.
Yeah. No, I'm finding my way.
We're all are. And one of the things I've discovered is we're all looking for ways to connect with our son or our daughter, and it takes a while to figure out what that connection is. And there was a group of dads down in South Carolina. It was actually the first story I did for the series, called Dance Dads. And these were these guys that did the makeup, did the hair, learned the routines, like built the sets for their daughters and their weekend like dance expositions, because for whatever reason the moms couldn't do it. And the dads, none of these dads ever imagined this is how their weekends would look when they were fathers, mind you. But they did it because their daughters wanted them to do it. And one of the things I've discovered as a father, as a journalist covering this beat on fatherhood, there's not a lot that a father won't do for their child. There's just not, and you don't fully understand it or appreciate it until you become a dad. Like my daughter yesterday, we're in the kitchen Sunday afternoon. It was about 3:30, and we just moved. We were unpacking boxes, and she saw some finger polish, some Elsa Anna finger paint or something, but she wanted me to paint her nails, and that's not really my forte, Brian. But damned if I wasn't painting nails at 3:30 Sunday afternoon. And, and there, paint, and every nail's a different color. And,
Yeah. You didn't have to paint your own nails, did you?
No, I didn't. I've done that before. I didn't have to do that
But
yesterday.
yeah.
But
I mean, not that there's anything wrong with it.
No, of course not.
Like,
no judgment.
I'm expecting that moment to come once my daughter discovers nail polish.
She will, and you
maybe
will.
That she's got a color in mind for my nails. You mentioned that you've forgiven your father for how things went. You've done it for him, and you've done it for you. Is this really important to everyone who has struggled with this relationship, like a tough relationship with their father?
Forgiveness, you mean?
Yeah.
I think so. I do, but I didn't. Forgiveness for me, it wasn't about my dad, and it also took. I'm a long believer, firm long believer in therapy. I had to forgive my dad, not for my dad. I had to forgive my dad for me. I had to get that burden off my shoulders, that monkey off my back. So it wasn't. The forgiveness wasn't about giving him a pass. It was about helping me move forward in my life. I also think, and this is one of the reasons, if not the impetus for writing the book, when you have children, you view fatherhood through a different lens. I was hard on my dad for a long time. And then you have kids and you realize it's not easy. And there's no playbook. Like, we're all doing the best that we can. And I had some decent examples. And my father, not to give away too much of the book, but my dad, the first line of the book is, my father was born in a prison in West Virginia. My grandma ran liquor, ran numbers. Like, she was a badass in the 30s. And so my dad was a jail baby and grew up with that burden. He grew up not knowing who his father was. And then all of a sudden, 30 years later as a kid, and then society expects that he's going to be Heathcliff Huxtable. Well, how is that a realistic expectation? And but that's what I did. That's what we do. We expect people to be certain things without the benefit of seeing those things up close. And that's what we did with my dad. That's what I did with my dad. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to let my dad know that I get it. All is forgiven. He was doing the best that he can. He was doing the best that he could. I'm doing the best that I can. You're doing. No one wakes up on a Tuesday morning. No mother, no father, no husband and wife. Like, you know what? I'm going to be a shitty parent. I'm going to be a mediocre spouse. Like, people don't do that. You behave in the way that you have experienced behavior, if that makes any sense. So anyway, part of the reason I wrote the book was to let my dad know that all is right.
And how's he dealing with all that? I mean, is he forgiving of himself now?
Well, I can't speak to that, actually. That's a really good question. I don't know if he's forgiven himself. I would certainly hope so. But it's funny, and you'll discover this one day. And if I'm lucky, I will as well. Grandparents are different from parents. You know, my dad has 6 grandchildren now. And when we see him interact with his grandchildren, my younger brother and I were like, who is this dude? Like there's no resemblance. Like we don't even recognize the father versus the grandfather. And which is good, you know. I mean, he's fully engaged in the lives of his grandchildren. But I think there's a part of him that's trying to make up for lost time, which is great. You know, he FaceTimes now and he calls, and you know, 5 years ago he didn't even have a cell phone. So he's come a long way. It's come a long way.
So with your own kids, you know, this is an interesting place for fathers of young children who are growing up in a world where, you know, there's really a lot. Like your kids have a good dad, an upstanding dad. You know, he's a busy guy. You know, maybe he's missing getting ready for school and breakfast. I certainly miss that. I try to help out during the work from home period, but for the most part, you know, we're solid. We're able to provide, maybe even provide a little bit more. Your father is now very engaged with them. There's a balance to be struck between giving them everything, sure, having them not want for anything, yeah, but also them being able to face some hardship, to overcome some challenges. Like, do you find yourself trying to navigate that space?
No, I'm not navigating. I'm failing miserably in that regard.
I mean, to say trying to navigate. I didn't say you were pulling it off.
No, I'm not. No, I mean, I try on good days, but no. I mean, I think, you know, unfortunately, as a society, there's a tendency to overcorrect. You know, the pendulum swings from one way to the other, and there was a few month period about a year or two ago, right before the pandemic. My son had developed a Greek yogurt habit where he didn't even like Faye. He wanted Chobani. And
oh Lord! Wow.
Yeah, exactly. You
kind of hate to say it, but it's almost not middle class problems. It's upper middle class problems.
Oh yeah, no. And my wife and I have had these conversations because at the end of the day, I think what we all want is to rear children who are resilient, who are capable of climbing the mountain that we talked about earlier, or climbing a mountain, any mountain for that matter. And I do worry, and not just about my kids. I think a lot of folks, you know, we're not struggling. You're not struggling. Like a lot of folks of my generation who grew up, you know, we were barely middle class, and then all of a sudden you get a good job and you find the perfect woman or husband, and you get married and they got a good job, and all of a sudden you're earning a good wage and you have access to things that your parents didn't have access to, and you want to, you know, the nature of, I think I would argue the nature of humanity is you want to provide better for your offspring than your parents provided. And like most things in life, we overdo it. We overdo it. It looks like you're looking at maybe some questions, B.
Yeah, I'm checking out. I know the questions are about to start rolling in because we're certainly getting to that portion.
Are there people watching us, or is this just me?
Well, yeah, there's people watching us.
I thought maybe
It doesn't matter. You know, this is a good conversation for me anyway. I mean, since you believe in therapy, it's just, honestly, it's good for me to talk to you because my sense is that we might go to bed around the same time each night if we're lucky, and wake up around the same time every morning in order to do our jobs. That makes us very, very different dads from.
But you know what? It does. But I would contend, and I had this conversation with Carson Daly, a colleague and a friend of mine a couple of years ago. We're all sacrificing something. Every father is sacrificing something. You're either sacrificing time, you're sacrificing, maybe it's money. Maybe you can't provide for your kids the way that you'd like, or maybe you're divorced and maybe, that, but we're all sacrificing something. What you have to do is get to a point where you accept the sacrifice. And you accept whatever you're sacrificing, and you figure out, you know what? Okay, yeah, I'll sacrifice this, but I can do this. So for me, it's time. And I realize I'm going to miss some stuff because of the job, because of the travel. So I sacrifice quantity, but I can focus on quality. So yeah, I may not be there for all of it, but when I'm there, we're gonna have some amazing memories, and this wretched device, this cell phone, is not going to be front and center. I'm going to be present emotionally and physically. We're going to take great vacations, because I'm not going to be able to be there for, all of the gymnastics or all of the soccer games.
Right. All right. Well, we do have the questions, as I promised. I told you people were watching and listening. They are coming in. So let me ask you, on behalf of Yvette. Yvette wants to know, what did you learn that surprised you about the challenges Black men faced during your dad's era versus the advantages of access that you now have? That's heavy.
That's a good question. I think that, going back to part of our earlier conversation, they just didn't have as many examples. There was not the benefit of, TV, or if there was television, the way we were portrayed back then certainly wasn't favorable, shall we say. And I think that's being diplomatic in TV and in film. And now there's social media. So I think, and even surrogate examples. Like I had a lot of surrogate examples, like uncles and teachers and coaches, and even when those years when my dad wasn't present, I had other folks who filled in the void. My dad and that generation just didn't have as many of those. I think that made it even more difficult. It really is, not to belabor the point, but if you can see it, you can be it. And if you can't see it, and if you've never seen it, if you don't see it, it is wholly unrealistic and wholly, not in the biblical sense, not H-O-L-Y, but W-H-O-L-L-Y, wholly unrealistic to expect that men can be something and do things that they just haven't seen. And that's what I was expecting of my father. And not just me. That's what society was expecting. That's what my younger brother, my older brother, we all expected my dad to be something that and that he hadn't seen. And then, oh, by the way, he was hobbled by a disease that we didn't fully appreciate until, I would argue, we didn't fully appreciate until 5-10 years ago. Think about how we used to talk about alcoholism or drug addiction. Yeah. Like it wasn't a disease. It wasn't a sickness. It was a weakness.
Right.
You couldn't get that monkey off your back. Well, you're just lazy. That's just right. You lack of discipline. Well, not, we do better when we know better. And now we know better. And so it's just that's a long answer to Yvette's question. That's why I don't do a lot of these things. Because
it's all right.
It takes me so long to answer a question.
I'm going to ask you a question. Another one that I think you got to, but it'll be a check back in to make sure you're comfortable. But this Pratham, and I hope I'm saying your name right. As a journalist who hosts many shows and has many commitments, how have you been able to find the delicate balance between family and career? Now, it sounds like you being present, no cell phone, good vacation. That sounded like a good answer to that question. But I want to know if you feel like you have found that.
No. I try. I haven't found it. I haven't found it. And I think it's funny because I've gotten a question a fair amount. I think part of it for me is we came of age. What are you like 40, early 40s? I'm guessing here.
Oh, man, you are being so kind.
Okay.
I really do appreciate it. I might as well just come clean, man. I'm 53.
Oh, man. Black don't cry. My God. So,
all right. Thank you.
But, it's funny because we came up, through the professional ranks before social media. And I also think before this awareness, if you will, that work-life balance was important. And I prided myself early on in my career of being the guy that always said yes. I would work that 16-hour shift and I'd work weekends. And, I didn't get married until later in life or have kids until later than a lot of my friends. I think as a result of that, because I was always working. Even now, unfortunately, I don't probably have as many good friendships as a lot of my peers because I work more than I should, because there is this deep, abiding fear, no matter how successful society thinks that you are, that someone could come along and take it away, take it from you, or there's somebody over their shoulder, and they're going to outwork or out-hustle. And so you feel like you've got to always go at 90 miles an hour.
Right.
And I still feel that. And as much as it drives me, and as much as I would contend it's probably been a decent reason for my success, it's hurt me. And I don't hold myself up as the best example of the work-life balance. And I work, I'm a firm believer in meditation. I use an app called Headspace to try and check it at the door. I try not to bring it home with me. But over the past year, especially, it's been hard to do that. Like it's hard not to bring a lot of what we cover on a daily basis. It's hard not to bring it home with you.
There's an interesting question from Raquel. Parenting can be all-consuming. Is it important to maintain outside relationships and hobbies, etc., to have a sense of autonomy outside of one's role as a parent?
No, it's not just important, it's paramount. And I didn't fully appreciate it until a few years into my marriage. Because, if it depends, it depends on your job, but when you have jobs like my job is all consuming. Like, it's just like, I'm never off, it's 12 hours a day. It's an all consuming job. And what was starting to happen was I was going to work, I was coming home, I was with my wife, I was with my kids, and that was it. I jog. I'm a bit of a runner. I like to work out. That was it. And my therapist a couple of years ago was like, what do you do for fun? I was like, what do you mean? I said, well, what do you do for fun? I was like, I hang out with the kids. She's like, that's not fun. That's parenting. What do you do for fun? I was like, what do you mean fun? Like, what is this fun you speak of? And she's like, well, what are your hobbies and interests? But I remember thinking, Brian, I was like, well, I guess I'm like my dad. I don't really
Interesting. Yeah.
And so I had a bunch of buddies that played golf. And so I picked up golf. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, my wife started playing tennis. So I started playing tennis. I used to play basketball. So I played some pickup basketball. But yeah, no, you have to have an identity outside of father or mother or spouse. Otherwise, you'll lose your mind, or the job. Like, I would contend most folks are really defined by what they do for work. Right. And I've had to struggle with that too. Like, you can't be Because what happens when you get fired? And that's what happens to all of us, At some point you get fired.
Well, let's change the topic. Let's change the topic. I don't want to think about being fired right now. So I'll just go on to the next question, which I actually think is a really good one too, from Crystal. What kinds of conversations should partners have with each other before deciding to have kids? Ooh. Any tips for talking to your partner about raising children?
Oh, Crystal's coming out with the heat. Oh,
yeah.
I think, and we had these conversations. I think you want to talk about the kind of parent you would be hypothetically, should you become, obviously not on the first or second date, but, you're dating somebody that's getting serious and, you both want to have children. You want to talk about the kind of parents you want to be. Because I think a lot of parents struggle with, there's this push and this pull. And especially if you were in a relationship, my wife is white. She grew up Catholic and Polish. I'm Black. I grew up Southern Baptist, and we grew up. We were different. And then all of a sudden you get married, and it's not just you're having children, but you got this meshing of families and cultures, and there were obstacles to be overcome. But we've been very good about having those conversations. But the important thing is to actually have the conversations. Like I think a lot of people think, we'll have kids and, we'll just figure it out. It'll be fine. And then you realize you have children and problems that already existed are exacerbated because conversations weren't had.
Question from Nicole. What was the moment for you, or has there been a moment where it really clicked for you, the impact of raising the next generation?
God, the Bay Area questions these are better questions than I usually get. It would be nice if people didn't read as much. An aha moment with regards to rearing the next generation. I won't say there's an aha moment, Brian, but I would say that there are moments every week where I realize that as my kids get older, and you'll see this too, like you can't dial it in. Like they ask questions that require legitimate thought. Like they engage in, my son especially, like he is legitimately intellectually curious. Like he'll ask a question, you'll respond, and he'll ask a follow-up, and then you'll respond, and he'll ask a follow-up to the follow-up. Oh. And then you find yourself like, well, no, like it's a Saturday morning at like 7:30. Like I'm not here for your existential conversation. But there's a part of you that's proud, especially as a journalist. But there's another part of you that's like, you know what? When we were kids, our parents would say, because I said so. And you read the parent books and they're like, oh, no, you're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to answer all the questions. But there hasn't been an aha moment. There are moments where, and it's funny because a lot of it's captured. As much as I was railing against this contraption, a lot of it's like videos and texts my wife will send when I'm not present of things that he has done or said. Like, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, he started summer camp and he's only 7. So, he likes to swim, but he's not big on diving. He's deathly afraid. And then some folks talked him into joining this dive team. And now he's all about dive. That's all he wants to do. And so in that story that's been developing over 3 weeks, in that story, there's this theme of facing your fears. And that's, and that, as a parent, that makes you proud. And so there are moments like that where you realize, okay, well, maybe I'm not screwing it up. Maybe the kids maybe the kid's going to be all right.
Well, we will let that be the last audience question that you answer. And we want to thank the audience because there were a lot of great questions. But before we officially wrap, there's a tradition with Inforum here to ask all of our speakers the following question. What is your 60-second idea to change the world? We're pretty excited to hear your answer to that, Craig.
60 seconds. Oof. I know this is going to perhaps sound trite, especially considering what I do for work. I think in this day and age, especially, one of the things we can all do to change the world is to be a bit more discerning in terms of our avenues for information. And by that, I mean, and I'm not here to rail against social media or cable news, of which I'm a part. But we live in a time in which there's so much talk about, truth, and what is true and what's not, what's opinion and what's not. And I think we would all be better served if everyone was a bit more skeptical of what they read, of what they saw, of what they heard, and they considered the source. Because the reality is, and you know this very well, Brian, if you can't agree on an established set of facts, then everything else becomes problematic. And that's where we are. Like, someone reads something on Facebook because it's been shared a couple thousand times and they assume that's fact, and they don't realize that's someone's opinion. And then they watch me at, 7:10 in the morning, and it's like, like Craig Melvin and the Today Show. And it's so we have to traffic in truth and celebrate fact.
Craig Melvin, thank you very much for joining me at Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. This is the moment when everyone would be applauding if we were in person, and I'm sure everyone is doing that little thing. I want to remind our audience that Craig's book, Pops, Learning to Be a Son and a Father, is on sale now. A special thanks to Marcus Bookstore in Oakland, California for partnering on tonight's program, and to the Bernard Osher Foundation for generously supporting it. If you would like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club's effort in making virtual and in-person programming, please visit thecommonwealthclub.org and thecommonwealthclub.org. I'm Brian Watt. Thank you very much and stay safe.